Hello! This video is going to be a little bit late. I read the book a while ago, but I haven't really had time to record. I've been very busy, but I finally have some time now. So, the second section that I'm covering of Fourth Mage is chapters 8 through 15. Sorry, 8 through 14. And a lot happens here. If the first 7 chapters of the book, which I covered in the last video, were sort of the setup, then here we have finally the true inciting incident of the book and the immediate aftermath of that inciting incident. So, a brief recap. After his brother's wedding, Nivare returns home and engages in a battle of wills with his father, who blames him for his fatness, whereas Nivare obviously insists on what we as readers know to be true, which is that the changes in his body are not his fault. Or at least not the fault of any change in lifestyle. It remains a bit unclear to what it's difficult to talk about whether something is his fault or not when there are in fact 2 Nivares, kind of, and one of them very much did desire this change while the other did not. So it's a bit of a complex issue, but certainly it is not the result of him falling into sloth and gluttony like his father accuses him of. Anyway, as a result, Nivare is locked up in his room and placed on basically a starvation diet. And then the Spec Plague hits and wipes out the entire family. The only survivors left are his father, who is in a significantly poor state in terms of his health, and his younger sister. Sorry, his older sister? The younger of his 2 sisters, but she is older than him. Anyway, Daddy Dearest then disinherits Nivare and kicks him out of the house, and Nivare goes off on his own to survive out in the world without the benefits of his family name. For the first time. And he briefly, for about a month, settles down in a small village, which was originally where the prisoners who were sent from Gernia to work on the King's Road were housed, and now all the people remaining there, the very few people remaining, are the survivors of that prison camp. But he ultimately leaves and is now heading further east, heading towards Spec territory. There's a fair amount of stuff I want to talk about here. I don't have a ton to say about Nivare's conflict with his father, because I feel like I've already said everything I have to say. That conflict is now basically over. I have been pretty clear right from the start of the first book that Nivare's father is very clearly portrayed as abusive right from the start, and I am glad that I was right in my feeling that the books agree with me, like that Robin Hobb did that on purpose, because there were some parts in the first book where I wasn't entirely sure if I was supposed to interpret the behavior of Nivare's father as profoundly vile and abusive, or if I was interpreting it that way but it wasn't necessarily written to be that way. And that part of that confusion was because Nivare himself is a very unreliable narrator, and Nivare himself very much did not interpret his father's actions that way back in the first book. Now there is no more confusion. It is very clear cut that Nevare's father is an abusive piece of shit, and everyone agrees with that, including Nevare himself now. Which I shouldn't be happy about. It's really terrible for Nevare, but you know, it's a part of me is glad to have the vindication, I suppose. Um, Likewise, uh, I've already said pretty much everything I have to say about the way that this series treats fatness and the way that it is a much more nuanced and interesting portrayal than a lot of than really any book I've ever read that wasn't like explicitly and specifically primarily about fatness and fat phobia. Um, and I do still think that there are certainly elements of it that are maybe troubling in their portrayal, but much like with Nevare's father in the first book, I do think a lot of that has to do with Nevare being an unreliable narrator and Nevare himself having a ton of self-loathing around his weight gain. Like there's a really difficult to read section here where Nevare uh, sort of looks at his body and is horrified by it constantly. Um, which uh, essentially he has a form of body dysphoria, body dysmorphia. I guess it's also dysphoria. It's both. Uh, Nevare has uh, some really serious body issues in his head at this point, um, and I think one thing that's kind of interesting is the way that the books the book constantly points out sort of the physical difficulties that Nevare has due to his new body, but the book also doesn't really back that up. Like the book, or rather Nevare in his narration, claims that his new body has essentially rendered him unable to do many things physically, but that is not actually borne out in the text because he constantly engages in extensive physical activity, and there is really no indication that that he has any serious difficulty with it. So I do wonder if that's a case of maybe just a sort of clumsy case of uh, Robin Hobb failing to adhere to show don't tell, or if that's actually intentional. And I suspect it is intentional because so everything so far has turned out to be intentional. Um, I want if it's an intentional sort of thing to sort of illustrate that Nevare does not have an objective ability to actually properly look at his situation. Like he sees it as much worse than it is. Because he assumes that the way his body looks now must come with certain major physical disadvantages. He sees those disadvantages, even if an objective outside observer might not necessarily see those disadvantages as real. Um, I don't know. We'll see where that goes. Um, but that is sort of an interesting thread I noticed throughout this section, like the constant repetition of Nevare complaining about how difficult everything is now because he's fat, but then also just him being totally physically capable and constantly doing the same stuff he's always been doing without any real difficulty other than like his thighs chafing together. Um, which is a thing that happens to people who are not fat too. Like that's not like it really does not take a lot. It really does not. You really don't need your thighs to be very thick before they start chafing. Like it happens to me all the time. As soon as I gain like a kilo of weight, basically. Um, so that's interesting. Um, Another interesting thread throughout this is Nevare's, I hesitate to call it budding feminism, but I don't know what else to call it. I don't want to say that Nevare's views on women right now are feminist in any way, because Nevare is still very, very much steeped in a very misogynistic culture and still buys into a lot of stuff from that culture. For example, with the woman he lives with briefly, Amzil, he has a very uh, a, a very negative reaction, sort of a moral judgment of her once he finds out that she's engaged in sex work. Um, but details like that aside, um, he is sort of having these constant moments of questioning and re-examining his assumptions about women's place in the world. First with his sister, when he realizes for the first time in his life that his sister's lives absolutely suck because they are young, noble women in a patriarchal, misogynistic culture. So, of course, their lives are awful, actually, and they have no freedom. Um, and then, of course, much more severely, once he begins to empathize and connect with Amzil and her plight as uh, as a woman who is at the bottom of society. Like, first he realizes through Epini and his sisters and his mother as well. He also talks about sort of his mother in this section. He realizes how awful it is to be a woman, even in the at the highest rungs of society. So essentially, the highest position a woman can achieve in this culture. And then he is faced with a woman who exists at the very, very bottom of this society. And he once again sort of sees that in addition to the disadvantages of her class position, there is also a ton of disadvantages that come inherently with being a woman in this society. So again, I'm not saying Nevare is like a feminist now, by no means, but by the standards of this society, he might kind of be one soon at this rate. Um, uh, it's not a major theme of the book so far, the way that colonialism and fatness and fat phobia are. Those are certainly like the forms of discrimination and forms of injustice that are much, much more emphasized by the plot of this book. Uh, but the gender stuff is still very much there from the first book and still being developed. And I'm looking forward to seeing where Nevare ends up in that regard and where Hobb is sort of taking us. Um, the other sort of theme that's running through this section is Nevare's magic. So this section is by far the most fantastical section of this series so far, not counting like the actual climax chapters of book one, um, which all take place in like the mystical spirit world or whatever. Obviously, those are the most over the top fantastical, but as a whole section, this section is just full of very clear and explicit examples of Nevare consciously or subconsciously just straight up using magic. Um, First, we see him survive starvation and dehydration for days and days and days, maybe weeks. It's not really clear to him or others how long he was locked in that room without food or water, but he survives it by basically going into a sort of hibernation state, and he doesn't even really lose any weight from it. Um, it's sort of one of the first examples we've seen of Nevare doing something just straight up literally impossible for a regular human. And he comes out of it uh, physically changed. His skin is described as having a different texture at one point, at like being sort of rougher and more and differently textured. Um, which reminds me of the way that the specks themselves are called specks because they have this speckled pattern on their skin. So I'm wondering if as we go forward we are going to see Navarre sort of physically, literally transform to be a speck. Um, the racial implications of that will... I'll talk about that more when and if it comes up, because that is a plot line that could have some unfortunate implications and some weird white savior stuff going on, but we'll talk about that later. Like, there's... I don't want to judge this series prematurely on that regard. Like, there's definitely potential for this to go the wrong way, but we haven't really seen Navarre actually interacting with the Specs and their culture that much, and I think we will soon, so I'm going to leave judgment on that until we actually get some actual Specs in this story. And hopefully, I will have a name for them other than Specs soon, because I'm pretty sure we don't have a name for them other than Specs so far, and Specs really feels like it's like the Garnian slur for these people. Um, I'm reminded of the awkwardness of talking about the singers in Stormlight Archive before we are given their proper name. Um, anyway, um, that's neither here nor there. What I was talking about here was magic. So we learn here that the fat that Navarre's body is accumulating is very directly there to power the magic. When he uses magic, he actually... it's like the only time he loses weight. Like, not eating food, physical exercise, nothing else helps him lose weight, but actually using magic leads to short-term weight loss, which he then has to regain in order to use magic again. So the first example of magic is him surviving without food or water for days and days and days. The second example is, I believe, him seemingly cursing some people. So he gets treated really, really poorly and doesn't receive any hospitality or aid from a military garrison he passes, and he sort of spitefully quotes this line from the sort of quasi-Christian scripture of the good God, which is basically like a version of the golden rule. Like, it's basically like, oh, the way you treated me is how I want you to be treated by others, or something like that. But when he does this, he feels his magic do something, and the soldiers react as though they felt something be done to them. They respond very violently. One of them chases after him. And one of them is so shocked that he falls off his chair. And Navarre still doesn't know what he did to them. And honestly, we may never find out. That could be sort of interesting. I think we might never find out, because how would we? It was a random outpost. Navarre is probably never going to go through there again. He's never going to meet these people again. So who knows if we'll ever find out what exactly he did, but he feels, and apparently so do they, that he did in fact do something to them with that. The next time it happens is when he is hunting deer, and you can't really hunt a deer with a sling, but he manages anyway, and that's the first time he does it really consciously. Like, he sort of actively, consciously desires to use his magic to kill this deer, and it works. But he still doesn't necessarily believe that he did it. And then the fourth time that he uses it is a true and proper example of, like, something that he absolutely cannot deny was magic. And it's a very important point in the book, because it's the moment where he can no longer pretend this isn't a thing. And that's when he instantly grows a vegetable garden out of basically nothing. Like, he touches the earth, and he wishes that there was a blooming, beautiful vegetable garden there, and there just suddenly is. Um, so it makes sense that this occurrence, this event, which sort of is the final nail in the coffin of Nevare's ability to deny to himself that magic is real and that he is in fact using it. This coincides with him meeting Hitch Buell, or Buell Hitch or Hitch Buell. I'm not sure what the first name is or what the last name is, because he's never referred to by his full name. He's only referred to as either Hitch or Buell. I think it's Buell Hitch. I'm gonna go with Buell Hitch. So he meets Buell Hitch, or Hitch Buell, and travels with him away from Amzel's little village. And in his conversation with Hitch Buell, I'm gonna keep just swapping between the two options, I guess. In his conversations with Hitch Buell, he discovers that Buell is in the same position as him, kind of. Not quite the same. He doesn't, as far as we can tell, have an alternate version of himself living in his head, and stuff like that. But he is also essentially a slave to the Specs, quote-unquote, magic, even though they don't call it magic, which is also something that's talked about here. Because he had a near-death experience, and in order to survive, he essentially agreed to become a slave to the magic. And the magic has plans for him and uses him. It causes things to happen. It influences the laws of causality, basically, to get him where it needs him to go, whether he wants to go there or not. And in this case, the reason he is with Nevare is because a wild cat specifically attacked and brutalized him in order to make him meet Nevare and take Nevare east. Because if that hadn't happened, Nevare might have stayed with Amzil for longer, or even long term, even forever. And the magic used Buell by throwing a cat at him, basically, to get Nevare where he needs to go. What's kind of interesting here is there is also the implication, or at least Nevare interprets this in this way, that the reason the plague struck Widevale and wiped out most of his family is because the magic wanted to get him out of his home. The magic wanted him to go east, and so it killed off his family to get him out of there. And this is a terrifying but quite plausible explanation, apart from one thing. So here's the thing that I don't know how carefully thought out and strict the rules of this magic system are. Because the thing I'm noticing in the case of Buell is that a misfortune struck Buell in the form of the cat attacking him, in order to get Nevare to go where he needs to go. And this is similar to how misfortune struck the Burvells in order to get Nevare where he needs to go. However, it is made pretty clear from Buell's own narration that the only reason the magic could influence him in this way, i.e. have a bad thing happen to him in order to move Nevare, is because he himself has a connection to the magic. So my question, I guess, is, assuming that the entire Burvell family isn't hiding some sort of deep link to spec magic, would the magic be able to just inflict plague upon them like that? Because so far, we've only really seen the magic act through directly forcing people to do something. Like, the magic works through agents. In this case, the agent is Buell, or perhaps the cat. And in what happened in Old Tares at the end of the previous book, the agents were Nevare himself and the spec dancers in the freak show tent. As far as I can tell, the magic cannot simply cause the spec plague to happen out of thin air. It can just push people to do things that reasonably logically lead to those outcomes. Like, the spec plague isn't actually magical. It's a powder made up of ground up feces or something that was I believe that's what was mentioned. Like the feces of infected people or whatever. Like it's a scientifically sound non-magical means of spreading the plague. The role of the magic in the plague hitting old Tares was specifically that the magic caused specific individuals to act in ways that led to that happening. So it's a very interesting way of doing magic, and I'm really, really interested to see more examples of it going on, because of course Nivare does do the crazy thing with the vegetables, but that's kind of the first real example we've seen, I think, where it's a definitive, absolute case of magic physically altering the real world, like directly, in an obviously magical fashion. So far, magic has mostly been affecting people mentally, really, or affecting the vague laws of causality in some way. So I'm curious to learn way more about how this magic system works, and I'm assuming we will once Nivare gets to the specs. The book is called Forest Mage. I'm sure it involves him learning magic in the forest from the specs. Those are sort of the major things I wanted to talk about in terms of themes in this section. However, I do want to also comment on one thing, which is my overall impression of this book and this series so far, and that is, I talked when I originally started the Soldier Sun trilogy. I talked about sort of having, the idea that the setting and the plot of this and the sort of subgenre of fantasy that this series represents is just, not necessarily to my personal tastes. It's not my favorite type of book. And that probably remains the case. However, I think that Robin Hobb is, through this trilogy, rising very quickly to be near the top of my list of favorite authors. Even though she, at least in this case, is telling a story that isn't necessarily the kind of story I most like to read, she is a titan of her craft. Like, as a writer, I cannot remember many cases where I was this in awe of another writer's craft this consistently as I read a book. I'm in awe in a very different way when I read Tamsin Muir's work. I think Tamsin Muir is also an incredibly talented writer, but so I'm currently reading two of the most talented writers I've ever read, which is a great treat for me. I'm so happy that I'm reading these two authors at the same time. However, if I were to sort of make a distinction, I would say that with Tamsin Muir, it feels like this raw, natural talent. It feels like someone who just, like, it feels like she didn't work for it. It feels like it just sort of happened to her. Like she's just supernaturally gifted in a way at writing. Whereas with Robin Hobb, you get the feeling of someone who has spent decades truly perfecting this skill and this art form. And the results in both cases are incredible works of literature, but they have a different feel, I guess. I don't know if I'm making much sense. This barely makes sense to me, what I just said, but I I feel like there's an argument to be made in what I'm saying here, and I hope neither Hobb nor Muir would take my descriptions of their styles as in any way offensive or reductive, because again, they are two of my favorite authors in terms of just pure skill at writing. Um, and this is very much cementing my desire to eventually read Hobb's more famous work, The Realm of the Elderlings, because of course everything I know about The Realm of the Elderlings tells me that those books are much more to my taste in terms of their setting and plot and stuff like that. Uh, and if I am this immersed and enjoying these books this much, despite them not being to my tastes, I cannot imagine how much I would enjoy work by this same author that does sort of hit the sweet spot of my taste. Um, anyway, uh, I think that's everything I want to talk about in this particular section. Um, I'm sure I missed some stuff, but that's okay. I will be back next week, or 2 weeks from now, actually, to talk about the next section of this book, which I still don't know exactly how much it's going to be. These two sections have been 7 chapters each. We'll see if I keep doing that, or if I find a more natural ending point a couple chapters earlier or later next time. Who knows? This felt like a natural stopping point this time, though. So, see you next time then for more Forest Mage. Bye.